Thank you so much for that nice introduction. I'm really pleased to have the chance to speak with you all here at Case Western Reserve University School of Law about where we are in trade and where we should be going. Case is a great school, by the way. My grandfather is a graduate, and we have other family members who graduated from the law school. I really wish I could be there in person to talk to you, but trust me, I'm there with you in spirit, and I hope everybody's staying safe and healthy during this pandemic. First, let me make one thing clear about trade. It's good for jobs if it's done properly, and it's important to the economic well-being of our country and our economy. 95% of the world lives beyond our borders, and the prosperity and growth that trade brings to our shores has been really well documented. It's good for businesses of all sizes. It's good for workers. In fact, export jobs pay 16% better than other jobs and have higher benefits. So export jobs is something we should want to increase in this country. As a former U.S. trade rep, I'm always going to be an advocate for opening up more markets to products, services made in the United States. But the trade expansion must be coupled with trade enforcement. It needs to be fair. We've got to support American jobs and workers when other countries cheat, and unfortunately, too many of them do. Senator Brown, who's my Democratic colleague here in the Senate, and I passed legislation back in 2015 called Level the Playing Field Act, and it kind of is what it says. It was a law to try to strengthen the anti-dumping laws, the countervailing duty laws, so that when other countries are not following the rules, we can act more swiftly and more effectively. Now, some say that trade enforcement is so inefficient because it raises prices. But often those prices come as a result of countries not playing by the rules. In other words, by countries subsidizing goods, implementing predatory pricing, or meddling in the free market. Additionally, there are non-economic reasons to support American manufacturing, in my view. These jobs pay well, and they're the anchor of strong communities, and it's really a national security issue. It's hard to put a price on that. This combination of trade expansion, then, and trade enforcement is what I would call balanced trade. So it's both ensuring that we are engaging more with the rest of the world, exporting more of our good products, but also making sure that things are fair. As part of that balancing act, we need to be constantly vigilant and ensure that these trade relationships we form with other countries are healthy ones, built on fairness and reciprocity and transparency, and therefore are sustainable. If we've got that level playing field, I believe American workers and businesses can compete and can win. Unfortunately, for far too long, that hasn't been the case with some of our key trading partners, chief among them being China. We really don't have a level playing field with China right now, and it's one of the most important policy issues that we face today. Ohio has been hit particularly hard by this unbalanced trade relationship because of our heavy manufacturing. Despite us exporting hundreds of millions of dollars in products, auto parts, aerospace parts, crops like soybeans, our #1 agriculture export, we still have a significant trade deficit. As an example, Ohio has been ground zero for steel imports coming in because of government-directed overcapacity in China. In 2000, by the way, China produced about 15% of the world's steel. You know, that was not long ago. Today, thanks to massive subsidies and other forms of state intervention, they now produce more than 50% of the steel production in the world. So from 15% to 50%. And frankly, our steel workers have suffered from that. China also exhibits a lack of reciprocity with us. So its market is substantially more closed to American companies than our market is to their companies. We've got companies wholly owned by Chinese entities here in Ohio, and they're permitted to do that. But American companies trying to operate in China often have a lot of hoops they have to jump through. Oftentimes their intellectual property is taken. China also has relatively higher tariffs than the United States, on average 3 times higher. There are also non-tariff barriers to contend with. Some keep our made-in-American products out, some coerce the production of those products to be in-country, and that is an issue in China, of course. While China has made an effort after joining the World Trade Organization to become more market-oriented, in recent years, they've actually moved away from some of those reforms, some of those market-based reforms, and instead they've kind of doubled down on what I would consider mercantilism that you would expect in the last century, but they kind of revamped it for the 21st century, and that's reflected in the state of our unbalanced trade relationship. While the Phase 1 agreement we signed with China back in January put us on a path towards starting to resolve these challenges, we've got a lot more work ahead of us. I supported Phase 1, but there's more to do. Part of the solution, I think, is going to be reinvigorating what should be the most powerful multilateral international organization for creating that level playing field, the World Trade Organization, the WTO. We all know that there is bipartisan criticism about the WTO. Back when I was U.S. Trade Rep, nearly 15 years ago, I was critical of the WTO overreach by the appellate body on anti-dumping rules and on what's called zeroing in the dumping process. There are very real issues to address there, but in my view, now's not the time to throw in the towel and abandon the WTO, which is what some of my colleagues have been advocating. By the way, if we do that, we would be abandoning it to more and more influence from China, as well as other non-market economies. If we're going to be able to address the challenges posed by the current trade practices in China and other countries, we need to address two key issues with the WTO. One is this judicial activism by the appellate body. I think it's weakened the multilateral system, not strengthened it. Second, the WTO has become unable to negotiate new trade agreements. I worked very hard on what was called the Doha Agreement, which was supposed to be the next big multilateral trade liberalization agreement. Now people even forget there was a Doha Agreement or a Doha negotiations. These negotiations have totally stalled. I'm committed to keeping up the fight to ensure the WTO is functioning the way it was intended. Earlier this year, I introduced a bipartisan resolution expressing support for U.S. leadership at the WTO, while also calling for reform to key parts of the institution and proposing some specific solutions. I encourage you to take a look at this resolution if you haven't, and its proposals, because I think you'll like what you see. America has a long history of leadership at the WTO. We don't want to give that up, but we need to do our part to ensure that it undergoes the necessary reforms to once again become a really effective organization, fostering trade negotiations. So reforming the WTO, I think, is one part of how we should tackle China and other countries' unfair trade practices. But just as important, of course, is what we do here at home. And that starts with reforming, in my view, how we use Section 232. As you probably know, Section 232 was intended to be used purely for national security purposes, and thus has been rarely invoked, only a few times, the last being in 1986, 32 years before the Trump administration began using it more liberally. One reason it has hardly ever been used is precisely because it doesn't require any showing of unfair trade. And I think that has to be the fundamental of any trade policy. We need to be able to show the unfairness in order to take measures like the 232 measures, which increase tariffs. This means that other countries, when we use this tool, if it's not used for real national security reasons, are likely to respond in kind. Of course, they're going to put tariffs on our exports for no reason also, so they will retaliate against us. So you begin an escalation of tariffs when you use 232. Well, I do believe there are some countries where there is certainly a national security concern, particularly with steel. I think misusing the 232 statute and its national security rationale not only leads to other countries increasing tariffs on all of our exports to them, but it also risks the WTO stepping in and actually taking away our ability to use this important tool when it's really needed. I think 232 has an important purpose, and it ought to be there for national security issues, but we shouldn't use it more liberally. I've introduced bipartisan legislation to tighten up Section 232. It's called the Trade Security Act. It reforms 232 to ensure that any 232 actions are based on legitimate national security justifications, and that Congress plays a larger role in its oversight over that. First, it ensures that the proper experts in government are the ones who determine at the outset whether there is a national security threat. As an example, our bill requires the Department of Defense, the experts on national security, not the Department of Commerce, to assess the potential threat posed by imports of certain products to justify the national security basis for new tariffs under 232. Second, the bill expands the role of Congress by giving Congress the opportunity to disapprove of 232 actions by passing what's called a joint resolution, even when the action doesn't cover oil or petroleum products, which you can do now. Our bill takes a nuanced approach to the issue compared to some other proposals to reform 232, which is important. First, it doesn't narrow the definition of national security. National security and economics have been closely intertwined for a long time, and I think they should be. And I believe for reasons that we can see today with export control, CFIUS, and so on, that shouldn't change. The National Security Act, the Trade Security Act we're proposing also keeps unilateral Section 232 action in the hands of the President, so he or she can quickly act in the case of a true national security. It would take Congress quite a while to respond if it's a true national security, so the initial action ought to be in the hands, in my view, of the executive branch. In short, what our legislation does is it puts guardrails around 232, so it's used properly, but it doesn't decommission it entirely. I'm pleased to say we've gotten a lot of positive reception for this balanced approach. Ohio and national business owners, farm groups, chambers of commerce, and industry groups have agreed that we need to rethink Section 232, but in a smart way that doesn't create further headaches for Congress down the line. So I'm committed to trying to get this passed soon. Let me close by saying how pleased I am that CASE is holding this important discussion. Trade policy should not be set in stone. We need to be constantly reevaluating it and innovating how we go about doing business with our foreign trading partners to ensure we are creating the best environment possible for our workers, our businesses, and for all Americans to be able to see more economic prosperity. The last time we took a long, hard look at America's international economic competitiveness really was back in 1988. That was the last major legislation on trade policy that was comprehensive. Back then, in 1988, the internet was in its infancy, actually hardly there, and we were more concerned with what the Soviet Union was doing than anything that was going on in China. But more than 30 years later, we're in a different world. I think it's time to take a look at how we can address 21st century problems in trade with solutions that are 21st century solutions. Luckily, we'll soon have an opportunity to do just that and make a big push for an updated approach to American trade. Next summer, Congress is set to authorize the Trade Promotion Authority. That has to be reauthorized from time to time, and next summer is the time to do that. So that's an opportunity, as I view it. As we approach this important milestone in our trade strategy, I'll be working with my colleagues on a bipartisan basis to try to put together a trade approach that benefits all Americans and creates a level playing field for all of us. So stay tuned. Glad you're interested in trade. I hope some of you end up being practitioners, and maybe some of you get in the trade policy realm. And please stay in touch as you do, and I look forward to seeing you in person at some point at CASE or elsewhere. Thanks for listening. Godspeed.